Welcome. Welcome to today's webinar. It's run by Embrace at the Kids Research Institute Australia, and it's entitled Beating the Odds, Problem Gambling in Our Youth. I'm Jonathan Karapetis. I'm the Executive Director of the Kids Research Institute Australia, and it's a delight to welcome you here. Embrace is WA's first research collaboration devoted to the mental health of infants, children and young people aged 0 through to 25. Today, we're going to hear from a number of fabulous speakers, including the Honourable Kate Chaney MP, who is the federal member for Curtin. We're also going to hear from researchers here at the Kids and also from the Movember Institute. The focus of today's webinar will be on the changing face of the gambling industry and, of course, young people's gambling habits. That will cover the harms they are experiencing and the supports that can be implemented from a community right through to a government level. Before I introduce today's panel, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which this webinar is taking place, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been the custodians of the lands of Australia for more than 60,000 years. Let me particularly acknowledge that here in Perth, we are on Whadjuk Noongar land. I do want to also acknowledge the Yawuru people, the Kariyarra people and the Kaurna elders who are overseeing the lands on which the Kids Research Institute conducts its activities. I do want to acknowledge also the custodians of this land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people more broadly, whose partnerships are critical for the work we do to tackle the problems facing children and young people in this country. All right, let me start with a bit of housekeeping. I want to reassure those of you who will need to jump off the Teams meeting at any stage that we will be recording it and we will be sharing it with everyone who registered. At the end, we're going to have a live Q&A session. And so if you do have a question, you'll find the Q&A button in front of you. Please pop it in the chat and we will make sure that we cover those off. If we have too many questions, then we'll also make sure we get back to people in writing. So we'll make sure that all those questions are covered off. The first speaker is going to be the Honourable Kate Chaney MP, the Federal Member of Parliament for the seat of Curtin, which is where we're currently sitting at the Kids Research Institute Australia. Kate sat on the Federal Inquiry into Gambling Harms that released a report in 2023, and she's going to tell us more about that shortly. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Vincent Mancini, who's a Senior Research Fellow in the Human Development and Community Wellbeing team here at the Kids. His work's primarily focused on empowering fathers and father figures to improve the health and wellbeing of children. His role is supported by the Fathering Project, and his research interests are diverse, which spanning everything from neurodevelopment, parenting, to child disability, grief, psychopathology, and emotional regulation. Today, Vincent's going to be sharing research that he led into the predictors of problem gambling behaviours in young men aged 18 to 25. Following Vincent, we're going to hear from Dr. Krista Fisher, a research fellow at the Movember Institute. Krista leads a comprehensive suite of research initiatives aimed at promoting mental health and prevention of poor mental health outcomes among young men. Krista will tell us about the importance of meeting young men in the places that hold meaning for them, and share some of the initiatives that she's been involved with aimed at reducing the impacts of gambling harm. And finally, we are going to hear a lived experience from Mark Kempster, who's going to share his own powerful story of online gambling and acts as an advocate for the Alliance for Gambling Reform. In telling his story, Mark hopes to give impetus to the need for harm minimisation strategies. Mark, for your advocacy and willingness to share your story, can I thank you in advance for joining us online. Now, as I said, we will have that online Q&A. We have received some additional questions in advance that we'll also make sure to cover off. Kate will have to leave us a bit early because of Remembrance Day activities. And so we're also going to make sure that before she goes, if there's any specific questions for Kate, we'll make sure to cover those. So please, now or during Kate's talk, can you upload any specific questions for Kate, and we'll make sure to get those before we move on to Vincent. So without doubt, I'm going to hand over to you, Kate. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks for having me today. I'm so proud that there is research happening on this issue right here in Curtin. Early in my first term, I was approached by a couple of different parents telling stories about their young adult sons, and they were pretty horrific, actually. They were, generally 18, 19, 20-year-old men who had fallen into experiencing problems with gambling. And that happened quite quickly. The common thread was it had happened through sport and through the connection with sport and the sense that if you're good at maths and you're good at sport, you're going to be good at gambling on sport and it's easy money. And I heard these stories and thought, I want to learn more about this. Then a committee that I sat on then undertook this inquiry into online gambling regulation. And we heard 45 hours of evidence from people, and it was really eye-opening to learn how poorly we regulate the online gambling industry, the impact that it has and the predatory nature of the industry. And we came up with 31 unanimous recommendations, which is actually really unusual. And it was my first parliamentary committee, so I didn't realise how unusual it was. I thought, what a great process. We've all left our politics at the door and come in and listen to the evidence and come up with really sensible suggestions on how we can address this. And that involved regulating one central regulator for the country instead of, at the moment, it's state by state, and so we have a lowest common denominator approach, and all the gambling companies are based in the Northern Territory. It involved building a fund through some sort of levy to raise awareness about the issues, provide appropriate supports, a whole lot of other stuff, including banning ads for online gambling like we did with tobacco a generation ago. And that unanimous support, was an amazing thing to have. And we put that report in, and the government's then meant to respond within 6 months. Well, the government didn't respond within 6 months. It's now 867 days since that report was tabled. And every day, Australians lose another $86 million per day gambling. And that has been really, really disappointing. And there's broad support across the community for reform around online gambling, particularly in relation to ads. And I get people who say to me, I don't agree with anything you're doing, except keep up the good work on gambling reform. It's quite universal. And I think it is an example where we're seeing politics getting in the way of good policy. The big gambling companies donated $1.7 million to the major political parties last year. So they are pretty powerful lobbyists. The media companies make 3 different revenue streams out of gambling. They get direct sponsorships for some teams. They have inflated broadcast rights because of the value of the ads that can be put on the TV stations. And then they also get a cut every time someone places a bet on that sport. So they're deeply embedded and they say they're deeply reliant on that money. And the media companies make a chunk of revenue out of gambling ads too, so they don't want to give that up. And so this comes down to, I think, a decision between what's good for the community and what's good for the money and the power. And it has been framed as a balance. The government's saying we're trying to find a balanced approach, and they're balancing community harm with profit, which feels like the wrong balance to me. So it's been very frustrating, and I think there were some really strong, recommendations in there. We've seen that people within the Labor Party are not allowed to speak out. I know that there's a lot of backbench support for reform in this area, but they're not allowed to say it out loud, and so I think that's also deeply problematic when we see the political process getting in the way of what actually is needed in the community. So I will keep pushing on that. And I think that really the only thing that's going to drive any movement is for there to be enough public pressure on some of those key issues around regulating these companies better. Things like incentives, inducements. So at the moment, these gambling companies can advertise if you come back and bet with us again, we'll give you $500, free to bet with. And that feels like free money, but all the evidence shows that it drives more risk-taking and higher bets. There are incentives that people within those organisations or associated entities are given to drive up people's betting behaviour. So all the incentives are aligned with increasing losses and increasing damage instead of actually designing it to keep the community safe. And I'm not against gambling. I don't think we need a ban on gambling per se, but one of the biggest problems is that it is embedded in sport, and that I heard a story from a young man who was at school in my electorate, said in his advanced maths class on the board they had who was up and down after each weekend on their gambling bets, even though you're not meant to be able to do it under 18. It's so normalised that the kids who are good at maths and like sport, this became, the teacher knew, and it's just part of how young men talk about sport now. And I think breaking that nexus is a really important part of stopping the grooming of another generation to think that it's normalised. It's not about, pokies are a big problem across the country. Now, they're less of a problem here in Western Australia because we don't have them all through our pubs. But the issue about online gambling is that it's with you 24/7. You can't escape it. It's in your pocket. If you're at home, if you're feeling lonely or bored, it's very difficult to escape. And it also, the advertising for online gambling is very targeted and very sophisticated. So this personal responsibility narrative doesn't work when it's an individual who may be experiencing problems with gambling up against a gambling company that has 200 pieces of data about each individual that it uses to optimise their spending. So it knows when to target you with what sorts of offers, in what sports, what's most likely to induce you to keep betting. And so we have to move away from this idea that, which the tobacco companies tried as well, which is it's up to you, you've got to behave responsibly and create a level playing field so people who are experiencing problems with gambling are not bombarded with it the whole time. I'm really excited about the research that Vincent has done, and I guess not surprised at the outcome of that research that shows that young men who gamble online or do fantasy betting are then more likely to experience problems with gambling. It's certainly consistent with what I hear from constituents who come and see me about it. And I think all this evidence helps build the case that ultimately the government is going to have to listen to.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Vincent in a second with any questions, but I just kind of want to follow up with my own frustrations. Having been through the 80s and 90s with the very same arguments from the tobacco industry and also from the sports sector. So I used to go to the Marlborough Australian Open, to the Benson and Hedges cricket, and there were all these arguments from Cricket Australia and from Tennis Australia that their whole game would fall apart if they didn't allow ongoing tobacco sponsorship. Very same arguments that are being used today for gambling, for sports betting, to support the sports industries. And of course, it just took strong governments to say, no, this is so important. We're going to not allow sponsorship of sport and we're not going to allow advertising, but we're not banning cigarettes. And Australia's led the way. It's more insidious now because of the targeting. The tobacco industry very much targeted young people. Their whole advertising schemes were built around it being attractive to young people, being attractive to young women. In this case, for sports betting, it's targeting young men. And of course, they've got the much more sophisticated tools they can use these days. But I just feel like we seem to go through this in cycles. We don't learn the lessons and we listen. We allow industry to kind of dictate policy when in fact we know world doesn't fall apart if you stop if you stop the ability for sports betting to sponsor sport. We know they're going to find other sponsors.
It's absolutely right, and all the same narratives are being pulled out, and they are myths. I mean, actually, if you look at all the advertising to TV stations, 4% of it comes from gambling. So the world will not end. Other jurisdictions have made these changes in Spain and Belgium, and the world did not end for TV stations. Another argument that the gambling industry puts forward, which the Prime Minister repeats those lines, is that it will push people to offshore sites. The evidence has not borne that out in other jurisdictions. There might be a tiny increase in offshore sites, but it's insignificant compared to the reduction in Australia. The Prime Minister is also saying, we've done more than anyone else. Here's all the things that we've done. All of the actions that he lists came out of a review that was done under the coalition government that were implemented, they continued the implementation of those recommendations. But all those narratives that we've had from tobacco are being tried again. The personal narrative that you'll push it offshore, that it'll destroy media and regional news and grassroots sport. If the only way to prop up regional media, for example, propping up regional media is not by having gambling ads. If that's the real issue, let's have a conversation about how to appropriately fund media. If that was the true concern, we'd bring back tobacco ads. That's a ridiculous suggestion. So these are choices that we're making. And we have to just resist all those narratives that worked pretty well for decades for tobacco, and they're learning from the same playbook with gambling.
Vincent, do we have any questions for Kate?
We do. Kate, there was one question that came in earlier, which was, if you could wave a wand and introduce one piece of regulatory action tomorrow morning, what would it be?
So I think it would be banning online gambling ads from all platforms, just like we have with tobacco. That's the thing that I think would have the biggest impact on breaking that nexus between sport and gambling in the minds of young people. There's a whole lot of other regulatory reform I'd like to see too, but that would be my number one if I had that magic wand.
And there's one more question in here. A lot of support and people echoing the same sentiments. But one person has mentioned, perhaps from your experience, what you see as global best practice in online gambling regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So what countries are leading the way, or who's doing it the best?
Yeah, I think Spain and Belgium are both doing pretty well in this area. And they, particularly in relation to the ads, that they're doing well. Australia, we're actually the biggest losers in the world. We lose more per capita than any other country. So really, we could look at almost any other country and find that they're doing it better than we are. But certainly some European jurisdictions are leading the way in relation to regulating gambling ads like we have with tobacco.
Great, thank you. And there's one more question, if I can ask, which is perhaps some clarification on any distinction between something like a Lottery West or like a Lottery West type of organisation and then your commercial gambling operators, and whether or not that distinction is important and what those distinctions might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and probably the medical researchers may be able to answer this better than me, because the difference really is what that addiction looks like. If you buy a lotto ticket, you wait a week to get the result, and it's not that instant dopamine hit that you get if you are sitting with your phone gambling instantly. So I think that's often seen as being the main distinction is how it actually feeds addictive behaviours. And I think lotteries, there are statistically fewer people who experience problems with gambling via that type than online. I mean, obviously, pokies are a huge problem, and we've made some good decisions in WA about those. But if you think about the fact that it's 24/7 instead of only when the pubs are open, that's why we're seeing online gambling rates increase faster than any other type of gambling in Australia.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Vincent. We're going to leave the rest of this in your trusted hands.
Yep.
And let's hand over to you and say once more, thank you very much, Kate Chaney.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
All right. So for those of you tuning in online, you're here with myself, Krista, and Mark now, and I think it's my turn. Is that right? I can give a bit of a chat about some of the research we're doing. Thank you. I saw a question in the chat around social media and the upcoming changes in legislation to young people in social media. So I'm just going to pin that one for Krista, who will be talking about social media shortly after me. But I thought I would be able to talk a little bit about the research that we've done here at the Kids Institute that's been supported by Embrace, why it's important, and I guess how it started and where we hope to take this. Now, when we think about the Kids Research Institute, we generally think of little babies, toddlers, but really the remit of the Kids Institute is anything that would impact the health and well-being of young people from preconception through to about 25. For my own work, I take it's a little morbid, but I would say a womb to tomb approach to human development. Kids grow up, they become parents, they have kids of their own. So for me, I'm really interested in understanding what are the issues that are impacting young people today, but also the adults of the future, right? Now, the question that I would probably invite people here in the room, as well as people online, to think about is, how comfortable are you personally letting commercial gambling operators reach into the lives and the pockets, the wallets of young people? Because that's what we're talking about. So really, as Kate had mentioned, this isn't an anti-gambling platform, and I would be very explicit on that, because I think sometimes people may choose to paint people who are pushing for gambling reform as people who are trying to outlaw something that's almost always been around, gambling. And that's not the case. What we're trying to do is we're trying to push for changes that are evidence-based that can help keep young people safe. Now, as Kate has also mentioned, Australians are the worst at gambling in the world. We lose more money per adult in the population than any other country. It's about $1,500 per adult every year. So if you can imagine opening up your wallet or transferring just $1,500 out of your bank account, it'd be pretty grim. But we know that it's not evenly distributed. We know that there are some people who are more likely to gamble more than others, and we know that there are some gambling tactics, predatory marketing, targeted advertising that seek to exploit some of these willingness for people to take part in gambling. So for me, the rationale for my project was really one that was driven by the community. We get the privilege of being able to talk to parents here in Western Australia, as well as around Australia, to understand what's going on for you in your house right now. What can we as researchers do to help you better understand and meet the needs of your children, particularly in a time that's changing. It's 2025. Life is happening very fast and very rapid. And one of the things that parents came to us with was this marriage of organised sports and sports gambling, and the concerns that parents had. And earlier on in the bios, you would have heard that we were talking more about sons or young men and their experiences of sports gambling. And I really want to be clear that this is something that's been community driven. I spent a lot of my time working on research to do with fathers and boys, but not exclusively. But the parents were really concerned about their boys. And that's not to say that women don't gamble as well, because they do. And what we're actually seeing is commercial gambling operators start to try and attract a female audience by opening different betting markets. But the real focus and the real concern from parents has been on organised sport, and particularly the health and well-being of their young boys. Now, through the research that we did, what we're able to find is some really powerful evidence that maybe challenges some of those earlier narratives that it's the pokies. I think it's very common for us in Australia to say, well, it's the pokies that are the risk of gambling harm. And there's quotes from places like the Institute of Family Studies which say that participation in pokies is the most harmful form of gambling. But what we know is that actually, harmful for who is my question. And when we say harmful, what do we mean? Are we talking about financial loss? Are we talking about mental health and well-being consequences, social consequences? And again, I think in Western Australia, we've been very good at legislating and regulating electronic gaming machines. But focus or preoccupation with that is perhaps a little bit of a red herring for what we're looking at as an evolving sporting market. So on the slide that I've got up here now, you can see some of the, I guess, like advertising campaigns, tactics that are being used to, again, attract young people, particularly young men, into sports gambling. And what we're able to find in our second study that we were able to publish from some data from the 10 to Men study was we looked at all different forms of gambling and how young men are participating in pokies, sports betting, greyhounds, horses, casino games, online poker, etc. And so in our modeling, what we found was that the only type of gambling that was shown to predict later risk for gambling problems was sports gambling and fantasy sports gambling, which is, they're tied up in the same. You can't bet on fantasy sports without also betting on real sports. And so this challenges that narrative that it's the pokies, right? It's for young men in particular, it's the sports gambling and online sports gambling participation that's actually increasing risk. And so for me, if we can just go to the next slide, part of what I'm interested in thinking about here is how do we actually keep our young people, particularly our young boys, safe from gambling harms? I kind of think about this as the perfect storm for risk, being a young man in 2025 who enjoys sports. And perhaps gambling operators see this as opportunity, right? They're looking at these same things and they're going, this is how we can profit from these people. And I'm thinking, these are the types of things that we need to be really considerate of. We've got a population who are into sport. They're active on social media. We know that advertising campaigns can target young people as well as provide some very male-centered advertising. And as Kate had mentioned as well, there's this preference for skill-based gambling, right? It's not entirely based on chance, or so they think. They'll go, I really love the West Coast Eagles, and I know that this player is injured, and I know that this is what's going to happen. So I've got a system, and I can beat me, an 18-year-old man can beat $1 billion industry or a $32 billion a year industry to profit from that. And so we see this risk here. Now, the other thing that we did before I hand over to Krista as well is we spent some time talking to parents and young men in more detail. So we did a bunch of interviews. And one of the things that we heard as a resounding comment from parents was just how defeated and how exhausted they were by gambling marketing, particularly advertising. This is not including social media and the targeted advertising that's reaching their young people. It's the televised advertising. The amount of parents who said, how can I compete with Shaq? When they're talking about celebrity endorsement, I'm a cool, I think I'm a cool parent, but my child thinks I'm a bit uncool now. And they've got these celebrities who are endorsing these products, and my kid grew up idolizing these people. So what can I possibly do to counteract those narratives being pushed by celebrities? And for the young people themselves, the thing that I'm particularly concerned about, again, which is something Kate mentioned, is just how many of these young men disclosed that they started gambling well before they were legally allowed to do so. So part of the regulatory narrative, I would say, is how do we actually stop underage gambling happening? In other states, we haven't done it in Western Australia yet, but in Victoria and New South Wales, estimates are about 30 to 33%. So 1 in every 3 young people will gamble before they're legally allowed to do so. And what we're hearing from the parents as to how they're doing that and from the young people is, I have an older sibling, or I have a friend who's in the year above me at school, or I do it through my football club, or I'm encouraged to, or perhaps the most concerning for me is I do it with my dad. We do it together, and it's a fun way to bring us together and to enjoy sport and to get more enjoyment out of games that we wouldn't normally enjoy. And so for me, I think how are we able to counteract those really powerful narratives around social bonding and cohesion that are actually putting these people on a trajectory towards greater risk, not only financial risk, but mental health risk? I'll leave it there. I'll monitor the chat because we'll have Q&A at the end, but I will hand over to Krista now as well, who's coming to you from Melbourne. So Krista, if you're there.
I am. Hi, Vince. Hi, everyone. You happy for me to just take it and run, Vince? Yep. Can see a thumb up. Great. So yeah, I'm so honoured to be able to join this webinar today. I am joining from Melbourne. I'm a research fellow at the Movember Institute of Men's Health, and a lot of my work really looks at young men's mental health outcomes by firstly understanding the context that are shaping those mental health outcomes and young men's relationships as well, because we know that their relationships that they have in their lives, online and offline, have a really significant impact on their health and well-being. So my background, like I came to Movember from having done a PhD in young men's anxiety, actually. So by taking that mental health focus, that's a big part of how I ended up understanding and looking at these online contexts, but also considering gambling harms. What we know from the research that Vince and Kate has touched on is how many young men are impacted by gambling harms. And now looking at young men's digital worlds and social media and really wanting to understand how the things that they're engaging with online impact them offline. Gambling and the impacts of risky financial content that we see online, influencers or other male figures online glorifying behaviors associated with gambling and glorifying these very kind of affluent, materialistic lifestyles, and looking at the ways that marketing around gambling is really changed in this new social media context. So myself and my research team conducted a narrative review around gambling and young men's mental health last year. I have the QR code there if anyone's interested in looking at it. But we very much looked at the evidence base that surrounds the links between predictors or risk factors of gambling harm in young men. And also unpacked what those harms are that we're talking about, because often there are, the very troubling statistics that get talked about in the media and continually kind of pushed towards community around how much of a financial impact this is having on men and on the community more broadly, especially in Australia. But we know that the harms extend far beyond just the hit to the wallet. There are extensive and strong evidence that also highlights the ways that gambling harms and the impacts of gambling intersect with comorbid mental health issues, especially for men. So often we see gambling taking place with other alcohol or drug use. The significant impacts that gambling behaviours can put on men's relationships, and therefore the ripple effects of that gambling behaviours that we can see on other people around men. And it also needs to be called out that there is a strong evidence that also highlights the overlap between gambling behaviours and other forms of relationship and family violence that take place. When we looked at what those risk factors towards harm are, especially for young men, we can see that there are individual kind of risk factors that predispose some young men to be more likely to experience that harm associated with gambling than others. That can be pre-existing mental health issues, that can be closely tied to the social connections that they have in their lives and the ways that people around them may see or talk about or engage in gambling themselves. But also, as I touched on, we see a really, really significant and fast changing landscape of technology and especially social media that's really impacting young men's risks to not only seeing some of this gambling content, but also a huge source of opportunity when we think about health promotion initiatives around education about gambling, around sharing of lived experience stories, and also short form therapeutic or intervention opportunities too. So I thought actually that I might show you some videos that we've collated from a recent research study that I've been running, which was collecting data from young men themselves about the content that they're seeing online. So we were interested in the ways that masculinity is kind of being shaped, challenged in some ways, but also reinforced in other ways, through TikTok especially. And one of the significant themes that we saw shared, saw come through in the videos that young men shared with us was gambling related or risky kind of financial advice. And the study, we recruited 142 young men, which meant that we had access to just over a million TikTok videos. So this is only a very small subset of that. But I wanted to show you all today some examples of, firstly, content that can be harmful for young men, and especially when we're thinking about gambling harms, but also share with you on the other side the real sources of opportunity that we see come through, where young men are creating content or sharing content around how they themselves have gotten control of their gambling, educating other people about what gambling harms look like. So yeah, I'll get Vincent and the team over there to be able to show you that.
So you said you didn't even know, like, you had this rolling until
No, I
what?
had no idea. I woke up. Day 4 cashes, and we up to day 5. We got to day.
Let's go turn $50 into over $4,000 in 4 flips by taking.
Guys, you see with roulette, yeah? If you put 100 on black and you lose, why not just double it and put 200 on black the next time?
We make it back to day 10 once again after day 9 cashes.
I don't consider him a winning chance at that $8.50 quote.
The number 4 saddlecloth has the most wins in the...
You're going to take losses gambling. You're going to take losses. But as long as you sticking to shit, what the plan is, shit, I believe you're going to win much bigger.
So before I show the second video, I just want to touch on the importance, I think, sometimes of showing these videos, because you see the way that the algorithm somewhat continues to push and also in some ways trap you into that wash of content. But also highlight too the ways that this content is not just about sports betting necessarily. It can also be like these success stories that are shared by some young men that became overnight successes, and just the ways that masculinity is so kind of laced and laden under all of this content too. So the next set of videos we can go ahead and show now, if that's all right, team.
People tend to hide their gambling from others. Why do people with gambling addictions feel like they need to hide their behavior? You know who gets the most hurt by a gambling addiction? It's not the person gambling. It's the kids.
Do you think you're the only one who's ever sat up until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning trying to win back all the...
This is how gambling used to ruin nights for me. Today is day 80 of No More Bets. And I'm...
In their brain, the only way out is by continuing to gamble.
Thanks, team. So the regulatory landscape, especially on social media, is difficult, and I know that will be something I'm sure that will come up in the opportunity for question and answers as well. But what I really like to think about, and also hopefully to challenge other organisations and experts doing this health promotion work, is think about ways that we can show up on social media where young men are getting these messages and this wash of content and this marketing, to think about ways that we can encourage them to reflect on their own behaviour, to get really evidence-based and credible resources out to them in a way that is engaging, is entertaining, and is really reaching them in the spaces and places that hold meaning to them, which is social media. So I might leave it there and hand over to Mark so that we have enough time for question and answers.
Awesome. Thanks, Krista. That's great. So, yeah, my name's Mark. I am here today as a lived experience gambling reform advocate. The reason I am here is because I had a gambling addiction, a pretty severe one, for 10 years of my life through my 20s, and it was something that started as a kid. I was 15, 16 when I started gambling. at a local footy club because, again, I presumed it was a rite of passage, and that's not because of the footy club I was at. It's just the culture of sporting clubs we have in Australia these days, where where gambling has become intrinsically linked between sport and young men and clubs and local sporting clubs. So, it was something that I enjoyed to do. It was a pastime that I enjoyed, but this is early 2000s, but it slowly developed into a pretty severe addiction once gambling apps really came into vogue in Australia in the mid 2000s. So, it went from a point where I was gambling every weekend to by the end of my addiction, I was gambling every day, multiple times a day, and losing considerable amounts of money every day. It changed me considerably. It changed me from a person who was a really loving, friendly, social person to someone who became a really angry, vindictive arsehole to be around, basically. Like, I was a really horrible person by the end of it. It affected a lot of the relationships around me. I've lost a lot of people around me in my life because of it, because of the person it turned me into. And I was preyed upon really during that time by the gambling industry and the advertising that was around. So every week, every day, I was getting bonus bets. I was getting inducements to gamble from every gambling company. I had accounts with multiple companies, probably 10 different companies when I was gambling. There was advertising sent to my inbox. I was getting calls from gambling companies asking me how I was and if I was enjoying my gambling, if there's anything they could do to help me with my gambling, trying to pretend they were friends with me. And that's something the industry does in terms of reaching out to vulnerable young men and young women to make sure they get them on the hook as much as possible and pretend there's this fake relationship between the gambling companies and yourself to keep you betting even longer. I'm really passionate about the work I do now with it. Like, I've managed, and I'm really one of the lucky ones, I've managed to get myself out of my addiction with a lot of hard work and a lot of help from my family and partner around me. Like, I'm every time I do speak, I try and really emphasize that I'm a small percentage of people who does get out of the addiction. We see from the stats in Australia that most people either lose a lot of their lives to their addiction, or they don't get through it and end up taking their lives because of their addiction. So I am one of the small percentage who is lucky enough to still be here and be able to talk about this as I do. And the work I do now and advocating for change and as much as I possibly can, and just the work I do with a lot of people around Australia. Every time I do speak out in the media now, as in my role as a spokesman for the Alliance of Gambling Reform, I get so many young people reaching out to me every day. I've had people just while I've been sitting here, I've got a message from someone who's reached out to me on Instagram because they've seen stuff today and they've started betting again because of some of the social media clips that Krista showed before and some of the advertising they've received in the last week. I've been working with people in the last 12 months who unfortunately aren't here anymore because they've taken their lives because they felt completely trapped by an industry who just prey on young men and women with advertising in this country. We need so much change in this space. It affects people every day. I know how it affected me. I know how it affects these other people now that I'm working with. And it's why I'm so passionate about speaking up and letting my experiences be told and, coming to these type of sessions and making sure people are aware that this is something that happens every day in Australia. It's something that's happening more prevalently in Australia every day. It's becoming, we're basically on a tsunami of a gambling advertising addictions in this country. We're on the crest of the wave at the moment. And if we don't get the change that people like Kate before and the work that Krista and Vincent do to try and show the damage this is doing, we're going to lose a whole generation to gambling. So, I'll pass it back to Vincent there. We can have Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions, obviously, about my addiction or anything like that. Everyone's got any.
Cool, great. Thank you, Mark, so much for sharing a little bit of insight into your own experience and of the work that you do. If I can just keep you there, there was one question that came through before the webinar that I thought you might be in a good position to answer. Krista, if you did want to jump in as well, please feel free. But for you, Mark, one of the questions that came to us was, what are some of the common early warning signs that families or friends should look out for in young people who might be at risk of falling into a gambling issue?
For me, I felt that I pulled away from a lot of things. I pulled away from my social my social network, I suppose, around me and my family a little bit. And it was probably my friends have told me now, it's the little signs of me becoming just, I suppose, very emotional about topics when there's probably no need to be. And it's probably because of the stress and anxiety that I was feeling at the time. I lived a lie for 10 years because I was telling lies upon lies upon lies every day to try and cover what I was doing, it changed my attitude a lot when I was around people. I was very short and angry all the time. So probably to see those little changes in people, it is like, it's always worth asking the question, is something else going on, and reaching out to those people who are around you if there is something going on, because it is a very, very silent addiction. It's not like an addiction you can see, which is like with alcohol and drugs, where you can see a physical change in someone. It's a very internal addiction that I find, and a lot of people I speak to who have gone through the addiction say the same thing. It's something that you live with internally, and you don't really show it in a massive way outside of you, but it's those little changes you can try and pick up on in people that can really help sometimes.
Krista, if I can cross over to you now as well. There was a question earlier on, both before the webinar, but then also during, around the upcoming changes to social media and what that might mean for young people's ability to see some of the content that you were showing there. I think for me, my question to you maybe is not just related to online gambling, but any sort of harmful behaviours that you might see perpetuated through social media. Is this likely to be the silver bullet that people are hoping that will be to keeping young people safe, or are there some other concerns that we might need to look out for?
Yeah, I think I'm not alone in saying this. I'm sure you might agree, Vince, and a number of other subject matter experts in this space are saying, well, it's really important and affirming in a number of ways that government are clearly concerned about some of the negatives and harms, especially for young people associated with social media use. This isn't going to be the panacea or the silver bullet, as you said. There are a number of things that we don't know yet. And one of those big unknowns is what that will do to other unregulated spaces online. And I think it's really important for us to consider the fact that young people now, on average, are spending 6 to 7 hours a day online. So that's not all on social media, but a big part of that is social media. When that's taken away, what is going to fill that space? And there's so many components to that. Government is kind of saying that hopefully that'll mean that young people will go out and kick a ball again. It's not that simple, unfortunately, especially when we know the way that these tools and technologies and platforms are engineered in such a way that in terms of even the way that they're physically engineered, we know that kind of keeps young people on these platforms, keeps using them. They use behavioural science techniques to keep you scrolling, keep you engaged for longer. So what is going to happen to that time? It will likely be spent in other online spaces. When we're so used to just picking up our phone, the attention will go elsewhere in a similar or as similar way as possible. And one concerning way where that might go is other gamified gaming, gambling spaces. And especially for young men, that's a concern. And, in terms of the other benefits and protections that social media can kind of hold, as I showed in some of the videos, social media can be a massive kind of lifeline for some people to not only learn about challenges that they may be experiencing, like put language to problematic gambling behaviours if they haven't seen anybody else around them talk about gambling, experience gambling addiction, label it as such. Social media can be a place where they find community, find help, and find support. So, yeah, that's certainly another space that's warranting concern.
Great, thanks, Krista. And if I can tie that one back as well to online sports gambling, again, thinking about some of the work that we had done with parents and also young people, is a social media ban like this isn't going to prohibit some of these young people who might be accessing gambling platforms through a friend, or, as I mentioned earlier, doing it with their parent, right? So for me, there is this cultural component as well that does warrant some addressing, that even if we're stopping young people from accessing social media and consuming a lot of this potential harmful gambling content, just thinking about how powerful some of those other social determinants of health are. If this is something that you do with your friends at your football club who are, a couple of years older than you and they're able to access that, or, you're in, if I can think back to one particular example of a school teacher who here in Western Australia approached me and said, I'm actively designing content to try and address online gambling problems I can see in my classroom in my Year 12 boys. This is something that I can hear them talking about it, and I can see the discourse, and I can see them getting excited and bonding over this. And to see that happening in a classroom where not all of these children are of age, Year 12 is that awkward time where a couple of people are 18 and a couple of people are underage, and so you have your legal adults coming to school and giving their peers an insight into adult life and all of the excitement and the risk that's attached to that. What kind of pathway are we setting these people up for? And so again, when we think about upcoming changes to social media, what that isn't necessarily going to alleviate are some of those other social levers that are kind of pushing these young people towards gambling risk. The conversation as well, one between parents and their children, and again, it's often fathers and sons that utilize sports betting as a way to come closer together. One of the questions I posed to an audience in a similar conversation like this was, I don't think we can just ask, can young people afford to gamble? I think the question is now, can young people afford to stop gambling? If your social network and your relationship with your dad and all of your friends are built around conversations about sports gambling and how much money people are winning and who's betting on what, then the risk for these young people to withdraw, they risk sort of social isolation and social persecution potentially. So again, thinking about what are some strategies that parents as well as young people, friends who have friends who gamble, what are some opportunities that we can present those people as well? I think with young men in particular, if you're looking at sort of in that 16 to 25 bracket, if you ask them what they care about, it's generally their mates, right? It's all about friendships. It's all about finding your feet as an emerging adult, and your social network is so important to you. So for young men who often really care about their friends, how can we equip them with the resources they need to say, actually, you know what, like, let's pursue another type of activity that can be just as fun, just as rewarding. Do we really need to have our entire friendship group built around sports gambling at the epicenter of this, or can we actually construct our social network in a way that might be built around something that is a little less harmful, both in the short term and the long term as well? I might also throw to people who are in the room if there's any questions. Again, people online can post questions if there are any others, but I just realised we've got a few people here who might have some burning questions potentially. Don't all speak at once. Got one up the front here. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks so much. I'm really interested in what happens before kids are teenagers. So we know that lots of games and things like that have kind of gambling elements to them. I just wondered whether you or anybody else on the panel wanted to comment on how we stop that, even for really little kids, and where that leads.
Yeah, this is a great question. There's two parts to that, and I will hand over to Krista and Mark. But what I would say is that, as Krista mentioned, this idea about the gamblification of other activities, gaming is the one that comes up a lot, because a lot of the mechanisms that get people into gaming, get kids into gaming and keep them there, rely on the same behavioural principles that gambling operators do. There's a chance-based component, there's currency that's involved, tends to be in-game currency, so it's mediated through the amount of parents that are talking to me about Roblox and Robux and Fortnite and other gaming-related things that they consider to be gambling-esque. What kind of pathway that sets children up for? So it is a really relevant question, and there has been some legislation pushed, particularly in Europe, around things like loot boxing as a mechanism in gaming and being able to get rid of that. or at least legislate that a lot better. But then the other thing as well is some research would show that children under 10 are able to identify sporting clubs based on the betting company that's actually sponsoring that club. So if you're a company that's, let's say, sponsored by Bet365, you can show young children just the Bet365 logo and say, what team is this? And they'll know what team it is. So the grooming, as Kate had used the term, which I think is actually really relevant, of setting these children up to be familiar with these brands, to be able to understand that this brand is associated with this team who I love, and you imagine your idolized athlete who's up there winning Brownlows or kicking goals, or the person you look up to who's proudly wearing a jersey that has, you know, a particular betting company on that, what that's setting children up for as well. Mark or Krista, I don't know if you had anything to add, particularly around the first question of children who are pre-teen and the influence of gamblified activities.
You can go, Krista, if you want.
Okay, I can just jump in to say I totally agree with all of Vince's reflections, and where I see solutions, or essentially what we do about this, is I think that there are ways that we can teach young people to implement those emotional regulation strategies, or to think about kind of a more critical or conscious way of engaging with not only these games, but also then more broadly digital tools and technologies that, as Vince mentioned, then can kind of almost intersect with every different point across their development that they're going to be interacting with these gamblified tools and technologies, but also activities now. So I think that's a really good way to think about like how we can help young people establish strong emotional regulation abilities, to think about screen time settings or things that they can set themselves, you know, really take empowerment, empower them to take kind of ownership of these behaviours as well. So yeah, they're just some additional reflections from me.
It is something that I am really big about, because I've been to local footy and local Auskick with my son who's 7 at the moment. I was down there this year, and I could hear kids talking about the football that weekend in terms of odds. Like they were talking about, I heard one kid talking about, hey, Collingwood's $1.80 favourite this weekend, Dad, and the dad was like, yeah, no, we should talk. But like, in not calling out that's actually an issue, why the kid understands it more in odds than he does who's actually playing on the weekend. Like we have to break this link, and like the kids can't go onto the AFL app or the NRL app or the cricket app without seeing a gambling ad when they're looking up who's playing on the weekend and things along these lines. So it's really important to have those conversations with your kids at an early age to make them understand that sport is not about gambling. Sport isn't about playing the sport. It's about enjoying the sport, and it's about the mateship that you get from playing sport. Like I loved playing sport all my life, and I really struggle now with the fact that I have to kind of lose my love of sport because it's been gambling industry's taken it over so much, and kids don't see it in any other way anymore. So just for me, I think it's really important that we start speaking to kids about, yes, that is a gambling odd, but do you understand what that is, and having the conversation with them early, even though we shouldn't have to. We are having to do it now because of where we got to in Australia at the moment with the way it's set up.
Just to reflect on that as well, one of the things I would probably also share before we wrap up is your story there around Auskick and the integration of talking about sport in a gamblified way. It's about odds, it's about favourites, etc. Is one parent who was a parent of I think it was under 10-year-old expressed something similar, where they were talking to their young child, and their young child said, well, like when I'm a grown up and I want to watch sport, like I don't want to have to gamble in order to watch sport. And so for some of these young kids, this is how integrated gambling is with them, that they think if you want to participate as a fan, if you want to watch sport and consume sporting content, something that I think most Australians would do as a pastime, we love sport. But for these children to think that in order to be able to do that, you have to gamble, and then they're going to have to give up their love for sport because they don't want to gamble. This is how enmeshed this is. And I think the thing about people in general is that we're incredibly adaptable as a species. That's why there's so many of us all around the world. But sometimes that can also be a bit of a a disservice to us. In Australia, we've just all of a sudden acclimatized ourselves to a very predatory, huge gambling industry that we feel is kind of normal for us. But when we think and we look at the global scale, we lose more money than any other country per adult in the population. We've allowed gambling, particularly commercial gambling operators, to thrive and profit from our children, our young people, as well as ourselves as adults as well. So again, I would encourage everybody here in the room and those listening online or watching the recording back to think about how comfortable you are allowing these commercial gambling operators to reach into the lives of your children, your wallets, your home. For me, I think my threshold's quite low for that. I don't think I'd be willing to accept that. But again, for all of us to maybe think about how willing we are to let these operators continue to operate in the current way, or whether or not we actually do need to see some legislation to really better keep our children, as well as the adults of the future, safe from gambling-related harm. I'll leave it there. I think that's all the questions in the chat as well. So just, sorry, one comment from Lindsay around Victoria having a school education program, particularly around gambling and gambling harm. So how we might be able to see that rolled out into other states and territories as well. I think that's a fantastic idea. So again, thank you to our speakers, Krista, Mark, and also Kate, who is now wherever she needs to be. But thank you both for being here online, and again, Mark, for sharing a little bit of insight into your personal story as well. I think that's really important that we get that context. For those in the room, thanks for being here, and have a great day, everybody.